Good afternoon to all of our participants. My name is Corey from Wayfinders. We also have Jen on the line as well. We will be starting the webinar in just a moment. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to type them in the chat. We'll also relay any questions you have to the panelists as well. This meeting is being recorded. If you do not wish to have your face being recorded, please go ahead and stop your video so that you're not sharing your screen. Again, if anyone has any questions at all, please feel free to type them in the chat. You can also click the reactions button on the bottom and click raise your hand, and we'll address those when there is a break in the conversation. Okay, I think we can feel free to get started. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Bert Russ. With me is Michelle Rupp. I'm going to introduce the two of us. We're going to do the presentation about Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. Then we would also like to introduce the U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts. So I'm Bert Russ. I have been I'm at the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. I've been there since 1999, so about 22 and a half years. And the last 20 years, I've done voting work. And a big part of the work that I do has involved assistance for minority language voters in the enforcement of Section 203 of the Voting Rights. And we're going to talk about that, how it applies in New England over the course of this presentation. I'll have Michelle introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Rupp. I have been, I've been with the voting section since 2016. And before that, I was doing elections work with a nonprofit.
And then I know the U.S. Attorney Rollins was going to say a word or two about her office, all part of the U.S. Department of Justice. Michelle and I are based in D.C., but the U.S. Attorney Rollins could talk a moment about her office's work. I see, Corey, I can see she is here, but is she muted?
I'm not muted. I think I can't start my video because the host has stopped it.
Oh, sorry.
So I can be like a voice from Oz or something. Okay.
Okay.
If you guys are cool with that. Okay. So now the host is letting me visit. So, or allow my face to be seen. So the U.S. Attorney's Office plays a really critical role in protecting the civil rights of residents of our Commonwealth. And many of you on this call know me as the former district attorney of Suffolk County. I ran for office and was the chief law enforcement officer for Boston, Chelsea, Winthrop, Revere, Boston, of course, being the capital of the Commonwealth. I am now a presidentially appointed and Senate confirmed United States attorney. It is a different role. That's a different presentation that we can talk about, but I can tell you, I'm very, very proud of the work that our federal government does. And we are incredibly lucky to have two federal partners here on this call, experts, to talk to you about the tremendous work they are doing nationally, and then even in New England, specifically regarding voting rights. But I'm going to talk to you just for a few minutes about what we do in Massachusetts regarding civil rights. So the Civil Rights Unit in the U.S. Attorney's Office was created in 2015 under U.S. Attorney Carmen Ortiz, the first woman to ever be U.S. Attorney in the history of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We are one of two of the oldest United States Attorney's offices in the United States of America. Massachusetts and Virginia were both founded in 1789. The attorneys and staff in our Civil Rights Unit work to enforce federal civil rights laws in the areas of housing, education, employment, disability rights, and police practices, among many others. And of course, voting is one of those as well. That means that my office is dedicated to making sure that people are not discriminated against when they apply for housing, excuse me, or when they go to school every day to get an education. It means that we're dedicated to rooting out discrimination and retaliation in the workplace and making sure that people aren't discriminated against because they are differently abled or diverse in some way. At its core, the focus of my civil rights unit that Carmen Ortiz started is ensuring equal access for everyone. Access to housing, education, jobs, and access to the programs and services to which everyone is entitled, whether that be protection from law enforcement or whether that be medications used to treat opioid use disorders. One of the cornerstones of our democracy is access to vote, because as we all know, voting is an important way for everyone's voice to be heard, for everyone to participate in our democracy. And in my previous life, we've now seen people that don't normally look like law enforcement or the establishment step up and run for offices and be the face of prosecutors, right? Or the prosecutorial movement in a compassionate and evidence-based way where we talk about wealth and race-based disparities and don't hide from those hard conversations. My office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, is dedicated to ensuring equal access to the polls so all citizens choose to vote, who choose to vote can do so safely. And then even in New England, non-citizens with respect to certain local elections or residents, we are looking at involving individuals that are here, but their documentation status is questionable or in the flux right now moving forward. So we've seen places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, and others that in certain elections will allow being a citizen is not necessary. So what I will say is my partners with the voting rights section of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division work really hard to enforce the civil provisions of the federal laws that protect the right to vote, including the Voting Rights Act. And what we've done in the past, this office, U.S. Attorney's Office, we've conducted compliance reviews to ensure that polling places are accessible to those with mobility impairments and other physical disabilities. We routinely send people from this office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, out to polls on voting day to ensure that voters aren't being threatened or intimidated. We staff certain polling places on election day with monitors to help ensure that individuals who might not be fluent in English have access to ballots in a language, the language of their origin. So I am super delighted, you've already heard them speak briefly, but to have two peers and partners in this work, terrific attorneys from the voting rights section, Bert, Russ, and Michelle Rupp, to share more about this important work. And I'm delighted for all of you to see not only their talents, but also the great work the Department of Justice is doing in this space. Thank you for giving me a few minutes.
Thank you. And I want to echo the U.S. Attorney's Office has been a great partner over the years, in our election monitoring efforts, when we are doing investigations or work in Massachusetts as partners to protect the right to vote. And so we greatly appreciate it. I also run the election monitoring program, and so I am greatly appreciative of all the volunteers from the U.S. Attorney's Office who help us with our monitoring in Massachusetts. What I was going to start with was to tell you a little bit about the voting section. And so the U.S. Attorney's Office and the civil rights component works on a number of different civil rights provisions and statutes. The voting section focuses on federal voting rights civil statutes, including the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Help America Vote Act, the Military and Overseas Statute, UOPAVA, the National Voter Registration Act. We are in charge of all of those statutes to make sure that they are enforced and that people's right to vote is protected. The Voting Rights Act has several provisions that protect the rights of minority language voters who are members of minority language group. We're going to focus on Section 203, which is where there's a list of jurisdictions, and we'll go through the jurisdictions in New England that are covered to provide language assistance under this federal provision. There are other parts of the Voting Rights Act that also protect the right to vote for members of minority language communities, and we'll talk briefly about those as well. State law may also have requirements to provide language assistance, so our focus is on the federal requirements. You can find a lot more information on our website. And let me go there next. Sorry. One more. There we go. I will also, let me put this link in the chat. Oops, if I can. Later on at the end of the presentation, we can put the link in the chat. But if you Google voting section, you will quickly find us. And this has a lot more information. A lot of the information we're talking about in this presentation can be found on our website. The census also, since they are the ones who publish the list of jurisdictions that are required to provide language assistance, they also have a website with a ton of very helpful information. And so I'd encourage you to check out their website as well. We want to make sure we leave time for questions. So as you think of things, I think there was a note, please, you can write something in the chat or raise your hand and we will get to you. I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to talk a little bit about the language of Section 203.
Thanks, Bert. It looks like the PowerPoint is not forwarding.
Okay.
Still on the presenter slide.
Okay, one moment. Let me come back. Does that show it now?
Yes, great. Thank you. So as Bert said, I'm going to talk us through the statutory language of Section 203. And so the first question, of course, is what does Section 203 require? And the answer is that it requires election officials to provide any registration or voting notices, forms, instructions, assistance, or other materials or information relating to the electoral process, including ballots, in the language of the applicable minority group, as well as in the English language. So as you can tell right off the bat, Section 203 is very broad in terms of what it requires to be provided in the applicable language. And then Bert, next slide, please.
I'm just having technical difficulties. Sorry, one moment.
We do have one question in the chat. The participant asks, for translations, are the ballot and its instructions available in Arabic?
So we're going to talk about what languages are covered by Section 203. Currently, no jurisdiction has been required under Section 203 to provide Arabic language ballots. We sued a town called Hamtramck, Michigan, about 20 years ago, and because of problems experienced by Arab American voters, one of the remedies we sought was Arabic language materials. But under 203, no jurisdiction has been covered for Arabic. Let me ask, Michelle, can you see the next slide?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we are good. And I'm also going to suggest that a lot of the questions that people have are probably going to be covered during the presentation. So definitely, feel free to write them in the chat, but I suspect that it will be best and certainly will throw me off a lot less if we wait to actually answer the questions until the end. And that way we can just talk about the things that we haven't already planned to get to. And I'll just go ahead and apologize for not being the best multitasker. So next we have the ways in which a jurisdiction might get covered under Section 203. By statute, a jurisdiction is covered based on the number of citizens it has who are 18 years old or older, which is the voting age part, limited English proficient, and in a single language group. Limited English proficient is defined by statute, and it means unable to speak or understand English adequately enough to participate in the electoral process. In order to gauge how many people within a population are limited English proficient, the Census Bureau's American Community Survey asks people who speak a language other than English at home how well they speak English. The four options are very well, well, not well, and not at all. If an individual answers anything less than very well, they are categorized as limited English proficient. We typically shorthand limited English proficient to LEP. So if you hear us using that acronym throughout this presentation, and I'm certain I will, that's what it means. All right, so we're looking at a population that is eligible to vote because they're US citizens and they're 18 years old or older, but they're limited English proficient, so they probably need assistance to navigate the voting process, which can be complicated. And they're a sizable enough population as a single language group that Congress has required jurisdictions to make election materials and assistance available to them in the language that they speak at home. As you can see on the slide, there are several ways that a population might meet that threshold. The population can be greater than 10,000 people, or it can be more than 5% of all of the voting age citizens of the jurisdiction. Or if the population is on an Indian reservation, it can exceed 5% of all reservation residents. Regardless of which of these three size requirements the population meets, its illiteracy rate must also be higher than the national illiteracy rate. And by statute, illiteracy is defined as the failure to complete the 5th primary grade. All right, so I keep talking about applicable minority groups and single language groups, so we'll turn to that next on the next slide. Section 203 specifically defines language minorities to include persons who are American Indian, Asian American, Alaskan Native, or of Spanish heritage. Congress designated these language groups specifically because it found a history of discrimination in voting affecting each of them. And that's not to say that members of other groups may not also need assistance to vote, but these are the only language groups that are covered by Section 203 specifically. For other language groups, there are other more broad options within federal civil voting law that can protect them. And finally, it's important to note that when we talk about a jurisdiction being covered by Section 203, that could be a city, it could be a county, or it could be an entire state. And depending on where in the country we are, different jurisdictions run different elections. So in some states, cities run all of the elections within their borders, regardless of whether it's a federal, state, or local election. In other states, counties run all of the elections. And in yet other states, counties run the federal and the state elections, but then cities run their local elections. And Bert will discuss some of the implications of that in a moment. So Bert, back to you.
So let's talk a little bit about how we come up with the list, or how the census comes up with the list. Every 5 years, the census publishes the list of jurisdictions that are required to provide language assistance under Section 203. The most recent determinations came out in December 2021, and there are a bunch of new places, particularly in Massachusetts, but also one in Connecticut, that are now required to provide language assistance that under Section 203 previously were not required. And I wanted to, and the way someone gets covered, the census uses the American Community Survey, the formulas that Michelle has talked about, and then publishes this list. They will publish a new list in 2026, probably again around December. And so there are places that are added to the list. There are places that drop off because they don't meet the formula anymore. There are places that add languages that previously only had one language. And so there's a lot of movement on this list. A lot of consistency as well. Places are covered for decades, but it is meant to be dynamic to follow where the census data is and where the needs are. We wanted to show you, and hopefully you see on the screen the slide for the Federal Register. This is the list of places that are covered. We focused in on states in New England, but if you go to this site or you go to the voting section's website, you will see the entire list for the entire country. In Connecticut, there were a number of places that continue to be covered. Over here on the right, they do it by the community that's impacted. So the community is the Hispanic community, that's the language in the statute, Latino community. But obviously the language is Spanish. So it's the community that gets covered, and then the jurisdiction works with the community to identify the language needs. There are some places, Asian Indian That's multiple languages, but that's the community that gets covered. And then the jurisdiction works with us and with the local community to identify what specific languages might be relevant. Norwalk, the town of Norwalk was added. We've highlighted in yellow a place that's new. The other places were previously covered when the determinations came out in 2016. Massachusetts, there were a lot of places that are newly covered for different languages. Clinton, I'm going to try, I hope I won't mispronounce anything. Clinton, Everett, Fitchburg, Leominster, Methuen, Randolph, and Salem. I believe all but Randolph were covered for Spanish, and Randolph was added for Vietnamese. We also have a number of places that were covered last time, and it's not just Spanish, but in Lowell, Lowell is covered for Spanish and Cambodian. Malden and Quincy are covered for Chinese. And of course, with the Chinese, you have Mandarin, you have Cantonese. It's what the need is in a particular community. Rhode Island had some continuing coverage, Central Falls, Pawtucket, Providence. We continue to be covered for Spanish. Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine do not have any jurisdictions that are covered under Section 203. I guess I went too quick to this next slide, but the requirements of Section 203 are set to expire in 2032. Congress will need to act for these provisions to be continued. The last time Section 203 was reauthorized was in 2006. It's kind of hard to believe. I was around when it got reauthorized last time. That time is moving forward. That we've talked about how jurisdictions can be covered, counties or cities in Massachusetts and Connecticut, the elections being run at the city level, including the federal elections within those cities. There are some places where the entire state, when the state does things, are covered. So California, Texas, Florida are covered for Spanish for the things that the state election officials do. It doesn't mean that every county within California, for example, is required to provide Spanish language assistance. Individual counties are separately covered, and not every county is covered for Spanish. But some states, the population, usually the 5% trigger, is big enough. The voting age citizens where LAP is big enough in a particular language community that when the entire state is covered for the actions taken by state officials. So state documents that are put out there, state publicity efforts, things like that. I wanted, before we talk about what covered cities and counties need to do, I wanted to mention the outreach that the voting section does in light of the new determination. So we got the list when everyone else got the list. And then we got very busy writing letters to all of the places on the list, whether they were covered a long time or they were new, sending them a letter, reminding them of their obligations or informing them of their obligations, and describing in the letter what a program looks like. And that's what we're going to talk about in this presentation as well, what a successful program to provide language assistance might look at. We are doing calls to every place that is newly covered or added a new language. We've reached out to a number of places already. We're still in the middle of that effort. We reach out to community groups in those jurisdictions because a lot, we want it to be effective, and talking to the people in the community that are directly impacted is incredibly important in coming up with a program that's going to work and that's going to serve the people in the community, because that's what it's about, serving the constituents in the community who need this language assistance. We also continue to look at places that have been covered a long time and do outreach there, but a lot of the outreach focus in 2022 will be on the places that are new. By new, some places have had a program already for various other reasons and are continuing it. Others, this is brand new information for them, and they need a little more assistance and help in getting started. And places that added a new language, maybe they've experienced in Spanish, but they've been added for Vietnamese or Chinese or another language, and they're trying to get that part of the program up and running. We also visit jurisdictions to do outreach, to do election monitoring, to meet with local election officials, to talk about a successful program. Obviously, COVID has impacted travel, and we haven't done as much travel as we traditionally do. The hope is that as the situation with COVID improves and more and more people get vaccinated, that we will be able to return to some of the levels of travel and outreach that we've done in years past. We want to talk about what a covered city or covered county needs to do. We want to talk about the elements of a successful program. Michelle and I are going to divide these up, but I will start with translating and disseminating election-related materials. It's very comprehensive. Basically, all election information materials that voters receive from the elections office need to be translated. The purpose is to allow LEP voters, limited English proficient voters, to be effectively informed and participate effectively in voting connected activities. We have some guidelines. Those are also available on our website that the Attorney General several decades ago published. And they go beyond the statute to provide more guidance about a successful program. We have our letters to jurisdictions. We have consent decrees, where in the past we've sued some jurisdictions, including some in Massachusetts, where some of this was a while ago, with what a successful program might look like. I want to make a note here about translating materials. Obviously, it's very important to have materials, for example, in Spanish, to have signs, to have the ballots, etc. There is a note about kind of historically unwritten languages. So there are some Native American languages that historically were not written, and the limited English proficient voters who might need help may not necessarily get their information from a written form of the language, but more from communicating with other people. And there isn't a requirement for these historically unwritten languages to translate the ballot, for example, or translate publicity, a sign, let's say, in the polls. They should do publicity in the native language on radio or whatever way is effective for the community. But I wanted to know that none of the languages, I don't believe that applies to the languages that we're talking about here, but I want to make that note. There are a number of reservations that have triggered coverage, and the jurisdiction works with the tribal governments to determine whether written materials would be effective for limited English proficient voters. The translating applies to both machines and paper ballots. In every jurisdiction that in a federal election, the Help America Vote Act, a separate statute, requires each polling site to have an accessible voting machine that will allow a voter with disabilities to vote independently and privately. Those machines, if there's a jurisdiction covered by 203, must also provide oral, on the audio equipment, must provide a translation. On the screen, they must have if it's Spanish, a Spanish version of the ballot. And so we look at all of that, the equipment, paper ballots. Many jurisdictions, even if they use electronic ballots as their main way of voting, they need to translate paper ballots for absentee ballots, provisional ballots, etc. One important thing is to ensure accurate translations. We want to make sure the information is correct and reliable, understandable for the folks who are reading it. There are some, I think I mentioned this, there are some language minority groups like Asian Indian, where they speak multiple languages. You might have Hindi, you might have Gujarati. And for example, Queens, New York is covered for Asian Indian languages. The jurisdiction needs to work with the local community, maybe the census as well, identify what is the largest of those language groups within the Asian Indian community. And then they can do written materials in that one language. They may still need to hire bilingual workers that speak a variety of languages. There are sometimes different written forms of the language, simple versus traditional Chinese. And so again, working with the community within the jurisdiction to figure out what is going to be effective for the relevant voters. One important question to think about is the ballot itself. If it's a paper ballot, is it bilingual with English and let's say Spanish on the same document? Are they separate ballots where you have an English ballot and a separate Spanish ballot? Those are important questions that need to be considered. It's been our experience that bilingual ballots are the most effective way to ensure that LEP voters get the ballot in the language they can most readily understand. You worry sometimes with separate ballots, will you run out of the ballots at a particular polling place? If at a particular precinct, there's only a few people voting the minority language ballot, will that jeopardize the privacy, the secrecy of the ballot when those ballots are counted later? And you might just run into situations where a voter needs the ballot in a different language and it's not available. So it's just something, and we work with jurisdictions about their equipment, what the technology is, but our experience has been bilingual ballots are very effective in getting the materials out to people who need them. Poll workers need to be trained as well. It's one thing to have signs in English and Spanish, but if the poll workers don't put the Spanish language signs out, they don't put the Spanish language forms out, then it's not going to be effective. We've seen situations where you might have a sign. It's English on one side and Spanish on the other side. And the poll workers get two of those signs. So they can tape to the wall and the English side's facing out on one of them and the Spanish side is facing out on the other. And then you'll see it where the poll workers, because of training, they put two English versions of the same sign up and they cover up the Spanish sign against the wall. Those are subtle things, but things that jurisdictions really need to think about to make sure that the people who need the language assistance can get it. And we've mentioned with the accessible voting machines that they need to be have oral translation, audio, and of course the written materials on the screen. I'm going to hand it off to Michelle to talk about oral language assistance.
All right, so when we talk about oral language assistance, the key thing is having bilingual poll workers. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. It is vital to have poll workers assigned to the polling place who speak both English and the covered language fluently. There's no requirement that a bilingual poll worker have a special degree or a certification, but they must be able to provide effective assistance to voters. And I know it seems obvious that the person providing oral language assistance needs to be able to speak the non-English language fluently in order to communicate with the voter, but it's also really quite important that they speak English fluently as well. Otherwise, you end up with situations where poll workers can't understand each other. So for example, let's say that a poll worker can't find the LEP voter's name on the voter list, or the voter is at the wrong polling place, or maybe there's a problem with their identification if it's a state where identification is required. In order for the bilingual poll worker to be able to communicate the problem to the voter and figure out what the solution is, they obviously need to be able to understand the poll worker who has discovered the problem. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to provide effective assistance to the voter. So in order to ensure that a poll worker truly is bilingual, we strongly recommend that the jurisdiction check for fluency. If a jurisdiction relies on poll workers to just self-report their language ability, you get a lot of situations where people want to be helpful. And so they self-report that they speak languages that maybe they have some familiarity with, but they aren't actually fluent in. So for example, you get the person who studied abroad for a semester back in college, or they grew up speaking a different language with older family members when they were a child, but they haven't really actually used those language skills in years. And so the end result is that a jurisdiction thinks they've assigned a bilingual poll worker to a particular polling place. And then when an LEP voter comes in and needs assistance, the person who tries to help them, again, isn't effective. So making sure that poll workers really do speak the languages that they say they speak is critical. Once a jurisdiction has hired poll workers who actually are bilingual, it's important to train them. So we suggest that jurisdictions have specific training for their bilingual poll workers. And in those trainings, they can do various things such as confirm fluency, discuss election-specific terminology, agree on how to explain something like a ballot initiative, those sorts of things. But it's also very important that all poll workers be trained on some of the basics. So for example, every poll worker in the polling place should know that bilingual assistance is available and which bilingual poll worker can provide that assistance. They should know that the bilingual poll worker is permitted to assist the voter in the voting booth. And they should know that regardless of whether a bilingual poll worker is available, a voter has the right to be assisted by an individual of their own choosing. And I will get to that toward the end of this presentation. So when only the bilingual poll workers are trained on these sorts of things, you get situations where other poll workers might see an LEP voter struggling and they don't even know that one of their fellow poll workers is there to help. Or they try to tell the bilingual poll worker that they can only help the voter in certain ways. And those are the sorts of situations that obviously jurisdictions want to avoid happening. The next really big consideration for a jurisdiction is targeting, which basically just means figuring out how to assign bilingual poll workers to ensure that effective oral language assistance is available to members of the language minority group who need it. There's no particular formula that's mandated. Some jurisdictions use census data. Other jurisdictions run a surname analysis of registered voters. And if you're interested in learning more about those sorts of formulas, you can check out the voting section's website, where we have posted consent decrees from prior cases. If you take a look at the consent decrees from Section 203 cases, you will see examples, excuse me, of surname-based formulas. And those consent decrees are organized by type of case. So you'll be able to find the cases from Section 203 pretty easily. Which, regardless of which targeting formula a jurisdiction uses, members of the language minority group who need assistance must be able to receive assistance. So again, the focus is really on effectiveness. In addition, it's important for jurisdictions to work closely with language minority communities to help identify the polling places that need language assistance. For example, you could have a situation where, based on surname analysis, the jurisdiction would think that 2 polling places each need the same number of bilingual poll workers. But in fact, maybe one of those polling places is in a neighborhood with a lot of LEP individuals, and the other is in a neighborhood where most of the residents are not LEP. So working with the affected communities can help jurisdictions target their efforts more effectively. All right, so now that the poll workers have been hired and trained, let's talk for a minute about election day itself. Bilingual poll workers should be assigned to a role that will give them the flexibility to help a voter throughout the entire process. A voter may have questions at all sorts of different phases, questions about whether they're at the correct polling place, how to update their address, what the sign-in procedure is, how to cast a provisional ballot, how to operate the voting machine or ballot tabulator, and so on and so forth. So if a bilingual poll worker is the only person who's assigned to, for example, check voters in or to help them with the machine, they may not be able to assist the voter at every point at which they need assistance. It's also very important for LEP voters to know that assistance is available. And so we strongly encourage signage and name tags in the minority language saying that assistance is available. So for example, if a jurisdiction is covered for Spanish, it's better to have a name tag that says hablo español versus I speak Spanish. And of course, anyone who has worked in elections before knows that sometimes poll workers cancel on election day, and bilingual poll workers are no different. So jurisdictions need to have backup plans for when their bilingual workers cancel. Jurisdictions should also have staff or volunteers at the election office who can answer questions in the minority language on election day. But I do really want to emphasize that that is not a substitute for having bilingual poll workers in the polling place for at least a few reasons. First, LEP voters shouldn't have to wait extra time for answers that are readily available to English-speaking voters. especially in jurisdictions that have a lot of polling places. Trying to call into a centralized phone line can lead to some very long wait times on hold. And so we want to avoid that. Second, some things are just better explained in person, where a poll worker is, for example, able to point to the correct button to push or point to the correct field on a form. And then finally, before I turn it back over to Bert, I want to make 2 points about the languages themselves. The first is that some minority language communities have multiple languages, the South Asian community, for example. In that situation, a jurisdiction can provide written materials in one language, but it may still need to provide oral assistance in more than one language to make sure, again, that effective assistance is being provided. The same concept applies for dialects. So a jurisdiction needs to determine which dialects are commonly used by members of the language minority group in that particular jurisdiction, and then provide oral assistance in those dialects. The other point is that training bilingual poll workers becomes even more important in jurisdictions with historically unwritten languages, because those poll workers are the only assistance that the voters are going to receive in their language, and also because the poll workers won't have the luxury of forms and ballots and other materials in the language to use as a touchstone. And so with that, I will turn it back to Bert.
I wanted to talk a little bit about publicity. Election offices get out the word that elections are coming. They might use advertisements, posters, radio announcements, TV spots, their website. And so it's important for a jurisdiction to think about the range of ways that they get voting information out in front of the public. And we want to make sure that what they do is effective. I know in some places with reservations, there are local radio stations that do programs in Lakota or Navajo, or whatever the relevant language is. For Spanish, is there a Spanish language newspaper? How do people get the word out? How do people hear about things? And what is the effective way to do publicity? Websites are a great way to get information out. And one question is, is that an effective way to get information out to a community? More and more websites seem to be the way to go. And so making sure information on that is correct. Just as with the ballots and the signs and other materials, you want to ensure accuracy. I know some jurisdictions use automated programs. You press a button and then it translates the entire page into another language. They should be careful with that. Sometimes those automated translations introduce some errors if there's not a kind of a human checking to make sure things are translated correctly. Certainly creating a page that's in the language that a human created has its benefits. We certainly have seen situations where maybe street names are being translated into minority language, and yet the street signs are only in English. If someone's going to look for Green Street, if it's being translated into another language, the voter could get potentially confused. So just a word of caution for those jurisdictions when they're translating the websites, be careful with kind of automated translation services. You want quality control for all your publicity efforts to make sure that the information is going out is reliable. We've seen things sometimes where people have the wrong date. So double check the publicity that goes out and think about the ways working with the community that are the best ways to reach folks. I'm going to hand it over to Michelle to talk about other elements of a successful program.
All right, so I'm going to break these other elements down into a couple of categories. First is staffing. It's important to have someone in the elections office who is responsible for overseeing the bilingual language program. And it's particularly helpful if it's someone who themselves speaks the minority language. If a jurisdiction doesn't have someone in the office who can do this, who can sort of take primary responsibility for the program overall, you still want someone in the office who does speak the minority language, so that they can answer phone calls from LEP voters, conduct outreach to the minority language community, et cetera. Obviously, some jurisdictions are quite small and they don't have the resources to hire more than a handful of people. And so those jurisdictions sometimes need to get creative and look for other ways to make sure that they are providing language assistance to the community. The second category is working with the language minority community. These communities can be a tremendous resource, and jurisdictions should absolutely be looking to build those relationships. There can be any number of benefits from doing so. So some jurisdictions find it to be a very helpful way of recruiting bilingual poll workers, verifying that ballot translations aren't too formal or otherwise difficult to understand, getting feedback about whether their targeting efforts are successful, and so on and so forth. I really can't overemphasize how important it is for election officials and language minority communities to work together. The third category is documentation. So it's important to have a detailed written plan for the jurisdiction's minority language program. For a jurisdiction that's just starting out with 203 coverage, writing out a plan will help them strategize and anticipate problems rather than dealing with things haphazardly as they come up. But a written plan is also important for purposes of continuity. So you don't want a situation where your minority language program coordinator leaves and suddenly all of that institutional knowledge has gone with them. It's also important to document the efforts that the jurisdiction makes to provide language assistance. And this includes things like keeping track of which poll workers are bilingual and in which languages, where those poll workers were assigned and whether they did in fact work on election day, and whether the jurisdiction received any complaints about voters not being able to receive assistance. And the reason that it's important to keep track of these things is that, as with any other aspect of election administration, knowing what happened during one election, knowing what went well and what the trouble points were, will help that jurisdiction plan better for the next election. So that's everything that we have for Section 203 specifically. And Bert, before I move on, is there anything that you want to add on these topics?
Nothing.
Okay, so then we're ready for our next slide. So when I was talking about oral language assistance earlier, I mentioned that assistance from a person other than a bilingual poll worker is an option, and I promised that I would get to that later. So now is when I make good on that promise. This is Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act, and it says that any voter who requires assistance to vote by reason of blindness, disability, or inability to read or write may be given assistance by a person of the voter's choice. And then it creates a little carve out for the voter's employer or agent of that employer, or officer or agent of the voter's union. It's important to note that inability to read or write is interpreted to mean inability to read or write in English. So if someone is literate in a different language, but they're limited English proficient, this section does apply to them. That also means that it applies to languages that are covered by Section 203 and languages that are not covered by Section 203. So think of Section 203 as being the jurisdiction's responsibility for making sure that assistance is provided. And Section 203, or Section 208, I'm sorry, is much broader and is the voter's opportunity to bring someone with them to help. So regardless of the language, the LEP voter can ask someone to assist them. And you'll notice that the carve out for this, this employer or union carve out is really pretty narrow. So for example, there's nothing about the age of the person who's assisting, or whether that person is a registered voter, or whether they knew each other before that day, or what their relationship was, or even how many other voters that person may have helped that day. So sometimes you'll see jurisdictions try to limit who can help based on factors like that, and those factors are not in the statute. The important thing is that the LEP voter has requested that that individual assist them. And they can do that regardless of whether there is a bilingual poll worker in the polling place who speaks their language or not. So then back to Bert to talk about some other statutes.
There's some other provisions that also impact members of language minority group. The Section 2, which we do a lot of work with, prohibits denying or abridging the right to vote based on race, color, or membership in the language minority community. and we have sought relief. Sometimes the relief we seek under Section 2 can include an element of providing translation or other things to help ensure people have access to the vote. Section 4E is another provision, most commonly used in the context of Puerto Rican voters. We have brought cases in the years past where Puerto Rican voters were not able to access the voting process because the voting process was done in English only. This is an older provision going back to the 1970s, and we have brought some enforcement actions. Even before a jurisdiction might get covered under Section 203, it might have some obligations if it has a Puerto Rican population that needs help. More information on all of these statutes can be found on our website. And Michelle, I'll have you talk about the next slide.
All right, so we'd like to close by talking about some ways that community members and organizations can help with Section 203 compliance. And I've touched on this a little bit before, but the first way is really to build relationships with local election officials and to provide feedback to them. So you can help your election officials better understand the needs of your community, and you can help them understand where their efforts are bearing fruit and where they might need to try something new. If you think there are gaps in their minority language program, let them know what those gaps are and make suggestions for how things can be improved. Because as with anything else, and as with any other kinds of jobs or people, election officials are very focused on what they're doing, and that's going to mean that sometimes they don't catch everything. Sometimes there are things that they're just not going to think about. And so if you see those things, let them know, give them the opportunity to try to fix it. And if you have built a relationship with them, odds are good that they're going to be more receptive to feedback. The second suggestion is to volunteer as a poll worker yourself, or help to advertise when your jurisdiction is hiring poll workers. And this is particularly important for hiring bilingual poll workers, because jurisdictions often have difficulty hiring enough bilingual poll workers. And then third, if you think your jurisdiction is violating Section 203 or any other civil voting statute, please let us know. The Civil Rights Division has a complaint portal that you can use for any civil rights concerns you might have, including voting issues, or you can call the voting sections hotline. And the contact information is on the slide, but just in case there's anyone who might not be able to see it, the web address for the complaint portal is civilrights.justice.gov, and the voting section hotline is 800-253-3931. And with that, we are ready to take questions.
And I have put the complaint portal and the hotline number in the chat as well for those who want to see it. The first question I see is, you mentioned be careful with machine translation. Is there guidance or case law on machine translation, Google Translate, found adequate or inadequate? I am not aware of that issue being litigated, and our guidance primarily came out several decades ago before websites were used as much as they are. And the bottom line for everything is effectiveness. And so, if an automated program is very good and people can get the information they need and it's correct and accurate, at the end of the day, that's what we look for. There are a number of ways to get to effective. And I know jurisdictions have budget issues and others. I think working with the community who could try it out, try to click on the button, see what comes up. Is it understandable? Does it introduce a lot of errors? Those are things that they should consider. There's another question. Is there a literacy level requirement for English materials? Does Section 203 mention the use of plain language? Most legal writing is not an accessible reading level for even proficient or fluent English users. Translations are only as effective as the source material. That is a very good point. There is not a kind of a plain language requirement. And it can be challenging when you have let's say a bond initiative or one of these legal ballot initiatives that are very confusing in English, and they need to be translated accurately into another language. we often, states, besides the three I mentioned, may not have an obligation to translate, but we often find it helpful when states do get involved with some of those statewide statewide ballot initiatives to come up with an accurate and consistent interpretation that everyone, that every jurisdiction within can use. This may be, having bilingual workers who are trained. It is a challenge, though. It's confusing in English, and unless the state has its own requirements about how much plain language is required for the English versions, it's true the translations into other languages will have to track similar to what the English version is, which can be a challenge. Other questions those are excellent questions folks have. Other questions that people have. While we are, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm going to, while we're waiting for other comments, I'm going to put a few things in the chat. I put the complaint portal, and let me also try to put in.
We did have two questions come in as well. I'm not sure if
Okay.
You feel comfortable with me relaying those to you at this point. Would that be
Sure,
okay?
go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. We had one participant indicate, they said, you mentioned be careful with machine translation. Is there guidance or case law on machine translation, for example, Google Translate, having been found adequate or inadequate?
Thank you. I did address that one. I did see those actually from Douglas and from Crystal. I did see those and attempt to answer them. But if there's anything more I could say, if those two people ask those questions, if there's more you'd like me to say or you'd like me to expand on it, I'm happy to do that. And then another question is, in your experience, are the Section 203 triggers 5% LEP or 10,000 residents working well, or should those be amended? Our job is to enforce the statute. We enforce the statute Congress has given us. I believe there was some talk around 2006 about changing some of those numbers. So I don't have a view, but I will, my job is to protect the right to vote, ensure access. It really matters to provide this bilingual assistance. It really opens the doors for many voters who might feel reluctant to participate because they're uncomfortable speaking in English. If Congress, when it reauthorizes the statute, wants to include more jurisdictions, that would be, we'll gladly enforce that. I believe some states, California is one that comes to mind, have their own state laws, which have different triggers, and more languages are required under state law than under Section 203, the federal law. So you can come up with different formulas. Certainly, it gets a lot of places with a lot of people who need help, and we're going to focus on those. And maybe Congress might decide down the road to change the formula to allow more places to be covered. Another question said, I may have missed this. What is the population threshold where cities, towns are obligated to translate? This is a good point because so we start first with who runs the elections. And in Massachusetts, you have a lot of cities that run everything, the federal, the state, the local. In other states, it's done at the county level. But even when, let's say, Boston gets covered for Spanish, if there's a school district that runs its own elections, or if you have a county and a city within it runs its own elections, they also have to provide language assistance. I don't think we touched on that particular point. So Los Angeles County is covered for several languages. And although this is changing, there are some cities that run their own elections. And they also have an obligation depending on what the community is within that city. There was a city with a very large Latino population about 15 years ago that was not translating the ballot into Spanish, and the voters needed it. And so we brought a lawsuit against that city because the city was running its own elections and also had obligations under 203. In terms of how the county or Boston or whomever who's running all the elections get covered, those are the formulas. 5% of the voting age citizens or LEP, or 10,000 or more of the citizens are voting age citizens or LEP. And then of course the reservations have a separate formula. Michelle, do you want to, I've just been charging ahead here. Are there anything you'd like to add to the things I've mentioned?
No, I think you, as expected, have covered them quite well.
Other questions that folks have? I might add that, we focused on certain minority language communities in section 203. Our colleagues in the disability rights section also do a lot of work to make sure the polling places are accessible to persons with disabilities. We have part of that. We have to make sure the machines are accessible, but the disability rights section focuses on, can you get into the polling place? Can you move around the polling place? And other things that that could make it harder for someone with a disability to access. So the department is focused on all aspects to ensure that everyone is able to vote. We focus a lot on the language minority communities today, but other communities are also have protections, and the Civil Rights Division, whether it's the voting section or our colleagues in the disability rights section, do work in that area as well.
Bert, it might also be helpful to add that sometimes people know that there's a problem, but they aren't sure who deals with the problem. They don't know whether it's a civil rights issue or a criminal issue. And so, we do have a criminal division that deals with the sort of criminal side of federal voting law. And if you don't know who to report something to, you can just go ahead and send it in. We talk to each other. Certainly, we can send information back and forth. So if the criminal side gets a complaint that's really for us, or we get a complaint that's really for them, we can forward that to the appropriate person. So don't let that stop you from reporting something if you think there's a problem.
Yes. And one nice thing about the new complaint portal for the Civil Rights Division, you don't have to know, was this for the disability rights section or the voting section? You just fill out what the problem is, and then we route it to the right people to take a look. There's another question in the chat. You mentioned that there was no requirement on a degree or certification for fluency. Do you have any best practices to share for communities where the people hiring may not have the skills to validate fluency as part of the hiring process? Are there any recognized language or translation certifications we should know about? We don't have a recommendation on that score. Again, for us, effectiveness is what matters. Obviously, if someone has gone through a training program, a certification program, some court systems, when they need interpreters to help in the court procedures, they may require certain levels of fluency. For us, it really is about what's effective. Can the person provide the assistance? Can they be understood? This is one benefit of having someone on staff who is fluent in the language, because they can test the fluency of the bilingual workers that you're hiring to see how well they are. We worry that if you insist on the certification requirement, it's going to cut out a lot of people who can do the job, who can be effective, who can be fluent, let's say highly proficient, but they don't have the right credentials. We want to avoid that. We know there are challenges hiring poll workers in general. We know there are challenges in hiring bilingual workers. And at the end of the day, we just want to make sure it's effective. I speak un poquito solamente español, like very little. You do not want me interpreting at the polls. I would do a horrible job. I would be like a deer in the headlights if someone is speaking to me in Spanish. But there, you want to make sure that the folks can do the job. There are various resources. If someone doesn't say provisional ballot day to day in Spanish, there are glossaries and other things that can help them get up to speed. At the end of the day, effectiveness is what matters. Other questions that folks have? While we're waiting for other questions, I'll say both Michelle and I have done work in New England, outreach trips, been to jurisdictions, met with community members, a lot of work in Massachusetts in particular, which has many cities that are covered. And so obviously, I believe we have folks from other states as well. So we have some experience. It's wonderful to be in the state, to meet with different communities, to meet with local election officials. And it's so we're very happy when this opportunity became available to be able to talk with people in the larger public about civil rights, and particularly about our voting rights program. Any other questions that folks have? These have been excellent questions, very thoughtful questions. I appreciate them. A new question came in. Is there any way to get towns to translate to another language that is not one of the 4 language groups? I think working with, meeting with the election officials, talking with them about what the need is, kind of persuasion, working with your local elected officials, your city council members, your town election officials. I think that is a way to, even if it's not required by federal law, I always try to remind election officials, these are your constituents. These are the communities that you serve. We're talking about citizens who vote and or would vote if it was accessible to them. And so I always encourage people to think about, these are the communities they're designed to serve. Obviously, there can be challenges when a language community is smaller and people have limited resources. So I get that. But I think framing it that way, these are your constituents, there's a need, and it would be very helpful in this polling place to hire whatever bilingual worker that is needed. There's another question. To the question you're asking about testing fluency, I would recommend partnering with local community group to the population speaks that language. That is a very good suggestion. We're always encouraging the local election officials to work with the community. Sometimes even if you have like a working group that you can, when you have a new materials that are going to come out, sharing those, like this is a draft, can we get your feedback on it and get some reactions? Like that doesn't always work, but it's a engagement with the community can sometimes head off problems down the road. To clarify, what I mean is that, can I jump on the phone? Can I jump on a call with a potential hire? So the person is asking, could that person volunteer with the city to jump on a call and have a chat with potential hire for 5 minutes to test their Spanish? So I think that's up to the city officials, how they want to do that when they're hiring bilingual workers. If they want to involve members of the community in helping to test the Spanish, I think that would be up to the jurisdiction. I know there's the logistics of hiring bilingual workers and making that happen. Obviously, if they had someone on staff who was truly fluent, that person could do the job, and maybe there's less logistical hurdles from bringing someone else in on a hiring call. But the important thing is to get that fluency tested. Other questions that folks have? And again, I'll remind folks, if you Google voting section, I think I may have put in the chat as well, you can find a lot of information about not only the minority language provisions of the Voting Rights Act, but all of the different statutes that Michelle and I and our colleagues enforce around the country. If there aren't any more questions, I know Michelle and I are willing to stay on a little bit longer for those who would like to remain to continue to chat. We have a new question. Can you share experience how you were able to convince the town in Michigan to translate in Arabic? So it wasn't personally me. This was before I came to the voting section. We sued the city because of some violations of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And as part of the remedy to fix those problems, we asked them, we said, you need to provide Arabic speaking poll officials and Arabic language materials. That was part of the consent decree that they entered. The problem was inappropriate challenges were being directed at Arab American voters, where they were questioning the citizenship of Arab American voters. These were campaign workers who were at the polling place. And they knew nothing about the voter other than they appeared to look like they were Arab American. And the city, unfortunately, rather than saying you don't have a basis for this challenge, required Arab American voters to take an additional step before they were allowed to vote. That was a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and the city settled with us, and we had a consent decree that lasted for several years. I joined the section and was able to go to this town in Michigan to monitor the election and to look at how the city was doing. We've remained involved with the city. The consent decree is expired, and including the obligation to provide Arabic translations. I believe the city has continued to do that because they're serving their constituents. They have a very large Arab American population, and they continue to serve them. But that it wasn't so much convincing them. Well, I guess it was convincing them because we presented them with a consent decree to resolve a lawsuit, and they agreed, and that was how we persuaded them. Well, thank you all for being interested in coming and joining. Again, Michelle and I will stick around here, but I want to thank all of you for your interest in this topic. Please don't hesitate to reach out to the Civil Rights Division if you have no problems or you have additional questions, and Michelle and I will stick around a little bit. And for those who remain, feel free to type anything in the chat if you have an additional question. De nada. Eso me extend my thanks. Gracias por su tiempo. Do you know if Lowell, Massachusetts moved to Cambodia and Khmer voluntarily or following suit? They got covered by Section 203. And so there was an obligation in I believe it was 2016, where they were newly covered to serve the Cambodian community. And we did outreach then with them. Michelle, were you on that one, or was that another colleague?
Yep, that's me. Yeah, so, we meet with the, we met with the election official and sort of had some discussions about how they were working with the minority community, what additional steps they could make, things like that.
And they continue to be covered after the 2021. I think Los Angeles County is also covered to serve the Cambodian community. And those are the two places I know of where Cambodian specifically is. So it sounds friendly. Well, you made a difference. Very good. Very good. A lot of the outreach is successful. Like election officials, they want to serve their communities. we see our job as helping them succeed, particularly if it's new to them or a community is new to them. We help make it happen. We try. Corey, is there anything else you need from us?
Corey had to step away for a moment.
Sure.
So I'll be closing the meeting.
Any last call for questions? Thank you all. Again, we really appreciate it. These have been fantastic questions, very thoughtful questions. And once we're traveling more, maybe we'll see you out and about as we visit the States to talk about language work. So thank you.
Thank you for presenting and for attending this conference. The video will be posted in a few weeks on the conference website.